Welcome to the MyLifeInConcert.com podcast. I'm your host, Various Artists, and please join me as I time travel back and revisit almost every live show I've ever seen from 1975 to the present. So, who is it? Who is it? Or is it who are they? Who? Not the Who, or actually it could be the Who, it depends. But who is it? They're on your bucket list to see. Perhaps you missed them in their previous stops through town, or maybe they never came through your town. Or maybe last time they came around, you weren't yet into them, and in the meantime, that's really changed, and now you want to see them, but you weren't then. Or maybe you were too young, maybe you weren't even born. The reality is, you can't see them all. And when you're also into a lot of music before your time, currently missed shows, sort of mourning those that you missed in the present day, are always competing with decades of previous performances that you weren't able to see. But say you could strap yourself into a time machine and travel back and see any musical act at any point in time, anywhere you wanted to see them, any artist that you want, who would it be? Who would you pick? When would you pick seeing them? What time? When? Where? Where would you like to see them? And why? Why this act? I'm your host, Various Artists, and welcome to the MyLifeInConcert.com podcast, and this is episode 11, concert number 20A on the blog series, and this episode is titled, You Won't See Me, 20 Acts I Wish I'd Seen. Now, this is a sister podcast to episodes 9A and B, which were entitled Waiting in Vain, 22 Performances I Missed Between 1980 and 2020, which the initial blog entry went up to 2012, but I updated it since this is the year of COVID. And the point with these initial blog entries was, because I started the blog back in 2010 and wrote it to 2015 on Open Salon, is I was going through chronologically, as I'm doing now in the podcast, all of the gigs I've seen in my life. If you're into a lot of live music and you've seen a lot of live shows, one of the things you realize if you're a concert goer is part of going to concerts is not going to concerts. If you go to a lot of shows, inevitably things happen. Things come up in your life you have to cancel, you get ill, the tours get canceled, shows get canceled, all sorts of things happen. It's an outdoor festival, it pours, whatever. So I wanted to have an entry in my original blog series, an entry that would basically be a memorial to all of the artists and shows I didn't see. And I did it as a two-part list of 20. And I picked number 20 because, of course, there's the saying, hindsight is 2020. So I'm looking back at the past and things that I wish I had been able to do or I had been able to do. Now, with initially what was the second blog entry, which is what I turned into episode 9A and B, Waiting in Vain, I talked about gigs I was destined to go to. I had the tickets. I was trying to get the tickets. It was a go, and something happened. Either the gig got canceled, I didn't get there, and so that episode is there. I talk about not seeing The Clash, Bob Marley, Elvis Costello, U2, a whole bunch of others. So if you haven't heard it, go back and listen to that. And it's in two parts. Today I'm keeping it all in one part. It will be a little long, but hey, you can pause in the middle or whatever. The joy of podcast versus a live broadcast. Now, today's episode, which was blog number 20A, is about acts that I would love to have seen, but it's not that I may be seeing them in the future when things go back. These are all acts. Most of these acts are dead, or key people are dead, or they're just broken up and there's no way they're going to get back together. Or these are acts I would love to have seen but have missed. And it sort of ends at 1980 because from that point onward, while there's still a handful of acts I've always wanted to see that I still have yet to see, U2 would be one, Stevie Wonder would be another, and Tom Waits most of all. But generally, in terms of what I like and what I've been interested in, and in terms of acts playing in that time frame, I've pretty much seen most of the people that I have wanted to see, that I've been able to see. So today I'm going to strap on the time machine, go way into the past. Pretty much my tastes are mostly 20th century. I do like some classical music, but generally most of my listening is sort of from the 1920s onward. And so I'm going to be going back into the past and revisiting the 20 acts I selected for the blog in 2012 when I wrote it. 20 acts I would most like to have seen from the past. I also pick why I wanted to see them. I'll discuss that. Where I would most like to see them, what time frame, if it was a specific gig, I'll go into all that. Now, I thought this would be a good year, and especially as summer is just now ending, this would be a good summer to turn this initial blog entry into this podcast, because this is the summer we're all missing shows. So I figured it was relatable and to look back at the things we'd like to have seen as we prepare and look forward to a day in the future when we can go back to shows and festivals again. I'd like to remind listeners to remember to check out the mylifeinconcert.com website, and you can read the original blog entry that this podcast is based on there, along with many other entries for previous concerts. And the entries often feature photos, videos, images of ephemera that's related, etc., etc. We also have our YouTube channel, youtube.com/mylifeinconcert, where we have a library of clips from past shows, along with some old tape VHS music bits that I'm starting to transfer. We're just starting there, but there's going to be more. And of course, I also post YouTube versions of the podcast over there. And please remember to subscribe. I also post Spotify playlists under my username Various Artists. Maybe not the best name for that, but I start all the playlists with MLIC, and these are playlists to accompany this and other episodes that I have done and will be doing. We're also on Facebook and Instagram, so please like and follow. And I encourage you to leave your own concert memories on one of the various My Life in Concert platforms. Certainly for this one, share your choice for who you would most like to have seen. Who is it, and why would you choose that artist, and when, where? Let us know your choice for this over on the My Life in Concert website, YouTube, Facebook, and Instagram, whatever works best for you. I'd also like to quickly bring up the last episode on the Heatwave Festival, entitled Once in a Lifetime, the festival that took place on August 23rd, 1980, with the Talking Heads, Elvis Costello, the B-52s, the Pretenders, and more. Now, initially, I wanted to include an oral history of memories from fellow Heatwave attendees as part of the podcast, and I had put out sort of an open call for feedback, but I didn't get any. Now, however, once the episode went up, I got all sorts of great feedback from across platforms from a number of people. Heard lots of really interesting tales from that weekend. Also, in doing this, I discovered new footage and sound recordings have emerged from the festival. So what I'm going to do is, over the upcoming year, I'm going to be reaching out to some of the people who had got in touch with me. But also, if you were at Heatwave, have some memories you'd like to share, and would like to be part of this oral history episode that I'm planning for August 23rd, 2021, get a hold of me through the My Life in Concert blog, Facebook, YouTube, Instagram, or write me at info@mylifeinconcert.com. So let's go on with the episode. So just to recap, what I'm going through today is 20 acts from the past who I never got to see, and I won't be seeing. Like, there's no chance of me seeing them, or I feel there's no chance of me seeing them. Therefore, even if I saw an artist at a point that wasn't a peak, like The Who. Well, I saw them as the Two. Actually, the show was good, but it just wasn't the same. And I saw James Brown once, and it was very disappointing. Or if the circumstances were bad, the way down the line, there's a Prince show coming up. It was the most frustrating, annoying gig of my life. So these were less than ideal conditions. Not so much The Who. I did enjoy that show. But the thing is that even if I saw them once, that's it. I can't put them on the list. So let's say I saw someone who is a solo artist. I can still include the band they came from or whatever. So there's a little bit of leeway there. But this was a list that I created in 2012. And it's interesting because in the interim, one of the acts that I initially chose, and I'm keeping it on the list because I'm probably guessing I probably won't end up seeing this person, but one person completely shocked the dickens out of her fan base around the world by actually coming on and doing a whole series of shows. So, and I would never have predicted that in a million years when I first wrote the blog entry in 2012. But I'm keeping that artist in because I still have a feeling I probably won't end up seeing this artist. Also, there were some acts that I discounted at the time because versions of the band were out playing, notably the Stooges and Television. And I thought about this, they would have been ineligible at the time, but I think the Stooges are done. I don't think Iggy and James Williamson are going to be getting back together. But, hey, you never really know as long as people are alive. Same with Television. So I'm going to keep those two acts off the list, but I'll quickly mention, as if that's the case, the Stooges definitely would be on the list. No ifs, ands, or buts. I've seen Iggy Pop many times. He's coming up down the road in this series a few times, but I never got to see the original or reformed Stooges. And I know back in the day, because I'm in London, Ontario, and the Stooges were from Ann Arbor, they played in Michigan and around this area. So back in the day, I knew some older people who saw them in this area back in the day. And if I could have seen the Stooges, that's when I would like to have seen them, preferably, in southwestern Ontario at some point in that period in the late, or in Michigan, 69 to 71, in that era. And as for Television, I would love to have seen them, as they were really the band who kickstarted CBGB's along with Patti Smith. So I'd love to have seen Television with Richard Hell in one of those first weeks at CBGB's. I would have been one of 10 people probably in there. But anyway, so I want to mention those two acts. I doubt they'll reform, but they've done it before, whatever. At least I have mentioned them. Now, there is one honorary mention that was initially on the list, and then I realized I had to make an amendment. So I pulled this particular entry off the official list, but it's an honorary mention. And it's the earliest one on the list, and it would have been, let's see if I can have that sound. There we go. Louis Armstrong with his Hot 5 or Hot 7 in the mid-1920s in New York City. Now, the thing is, with the Hot 5 and the Hot 7, they were a studio-only unit. I believe they only ever played live once, and it was a private party. So I'd love to have been at that private party, but that's all there is. And I won't go into why. You can go to the blog entry at mylifeinconcert.com. Okay, I'm going to climb into the time machine, strap myself in, and head back to the 1930s for choice number 1 on my list. Le Quintet de Club de France, featuring Django Reinhardt and Stéphane Grappelli, again, some point in the 1930s in Paris, France. Le Quintet de Club de France was gypsy jazz at its finest, and probably the most uniquely European of all jazz styles. Now, the quintet not only sported a highly unusual all-stringed lineup consisting of 3 guitars, a violin, and a bass, it also most notably featured guitarist extraordinaire Django Reinhardt on lead, along with celebrated violinist Stéphane Grappelli. Now, Grappelli was one of my choices for, in episode 9, 22 performances I missed, and you can go listen to that episode and hear all about me missing a show at the beautiful Roy Thompson Hall in Toronto in the early 90s, and we can file that show under Too Broke to Drive To. Anyway, back to the 30s. The synergy between these two musicians created a timeless sound that has been recast and re-honored in all succeeding decades. Now, World War II tore the initial group apart, even if various post-war, more diluted iterations appeared later on. So, as to when, of course, I'd most like to have seen them in a club in Paris in the mid-1930s, when they were at the height of their performing powers, and also when they made all their legendary recordings. Now, as with the Bo Diddley beat, the gypsy jazz pioneered by Reinhardt and Grappelli in the quintet is always instantly identifiable and remains so with each and every update and refurbishing it regularly receives. This music, it just keeps going on and on because it always retains that magic. I'd also like to throw in that I have videos of all these artists on the blog entry on mylifeinconcert.com. Also, I have a Spotify playlist up of the artists on this list, and mostly it's live performances that are there. So if you're interested about some of the artists I'm talking about, you can go to the blog or you can go to Spotify and hear songs by the artists that I'm discussing. Okay, back into the time machine, strapping in, and it's on to my next choice, and we're just traveling a few years down the line to January 1939, and choice number 2... Billie Holiday at the Cafe Society in New York City on the night that she debuted Strange Fruit. So she's one of these names on this list. It's a given she's going to be there. So if I'm going to select a single Holiday performance, it's got to be the night of her first public reading of Strange Fruit, one of the most important songs of the 20th century, and highly depressingly, its message remains relevant. Good Lord. Holiday introduced this poem set to music about racism and lynching at one of New York City's first truly multiracial clubs, Cafe Society. Now, this club was eventually harassed out of business by authorities because of their everybody's welcome policy. Club owner Barney Josephson wanted the song to have maximum impact upon club patrons, so Holiday always saved it for the conclusion of her set. As she sang, her face would be spotlit, and it would be the only visible entity in an otherwise dark room. Also, waiters would cease serving clients while the song was being performed. There would be no encore. The powerful, controversial song was so hot at the time that her label, Columbia Records, refused to release it. Strange Fruit actually ended up coming out on a smaller label. Indeed, its regular performance at the Cafe Society shows provoked strong reactions from the clientele. As Tony Palmer relates in his classic 70s book, All You Need Is Love, The Story of Popular Music, quote, "One night, as the applause died away, a woman rushed backstage and punched Billie, tore her costume, and told her to never sing that song again. She was a Southerner, and as a child of 12 had watched a black man hanged from a tree. She had never forgotten it and did not wish to be reminded." According to Josephson, Billie first swore at the woman, then the two women burst into sobbing, unquote. Holiday had 20 further personally troubled but artistically brilliant years ahead of her. Yet, her rendition of Strange Fruit and the notoriety from its first performances remain recognized as essential high points of her unparalleled career, as well as music in the 20th century. It's mind-boggling to think that John Hammond had to fight to get her signed to Columbia Records. They said she had a scratchy, unmusical voice that she wouldn't sell. And meanwhile, here we are almost a century later, and Lady Day's music remains popular and influential. In fact, there's a new biopic coming out in February 2021, The United States versus Billie Holiday, with Andra Day in the lead role. So, there you have it. If I'm going to travel back and see Billie Holiday in the past, I want it to be at Cafe Society in New York City in January 1939 for the debut of Abel Mirapol's game-changing song, Strange Fruit. So, time to jump back into the time machine. This time we're skipping through the 40s and on to the mid to late 50s for choice number 3, Frank Sinatra, preferably with the Nelson Riddle Orchestra, as I said, sometime in the mid to late 50s. Now, of course, Sinatra had been around when I was growing up, but he was kind of the old school and pre-rock, and I really wasn't that interested. And it really wasn't until later on in the 90s. That was the period I really started to explore a lot of the pre-rock pop singers and sort of a lot of the, the classic songbook and, the early 20th century songs, and particularly, the pop singers who were singing these tunes, especially Joe Stafford, she's a big favorite, and Peggy Lee, but also Judy Garland, Patti Page, Tony Bennett, etc. But for me, Sinatra is the pop voice of the mid 20th century. So it's a given that I want to see him live and hear that velvet tone live, and I'd want to do so when I feel it was at its strongest and its most sublime, and that would be the mid to late 50s. This was a time of comeback for him because he had been a major star as, the Bobby Soxer, I love the Bobby Soxers in the 40s. But by the time he was in his early 50s, he was passé. He was seen of another generation. His film career was floundering. Everything was kind of going down the tubes. And then he had this relationship with Ava Gardner, which impacted him. It ended badly and impacted him. And then between From Here to Eternity and also signing to Capitol and starting a new recording career, he had a resurgence in the mid-50s. But where his 40s stuff, I'm actually not that big on. I keep trying to listen to it, and I'm not all that keen on it. It's really the stuff in the 50s, also the 60s too, but especially the 50s, when he started making these really classic mood piece concept albums, such as In the Wee Small Hours and Frank Sinatra Sings for Only the Lonely, not to mention a string of perfect old-school pop hits. And again, I think when he was with the Nelson Riddle Orchestra was pretty much his key orchestra. He was at his best. That's how I would like to have seen him. Now, as I said, he had a pretty great 60s too. There's some great stuff in there. He set up Reprise and his own label on that. But really, for me, it's the Capitol recordings and his oeuvre from that period that has become his trademark. Certainly for me, and something I never tire of hearing. And I'll spare you singing along with all of his tunes, that sort of thing. So there we go. Choice number 3, Frank Sinatra, in the mid to late 1950s. And so on to number 4, but for this one, really, we're jumping back in the time machine, but we don't have far to go. Really, we just have to bump things up a little bit more for choice number 4. The Miles Davis Sextet, somewhere in a club between 1958 and 1960 with John Coltrane in the band. Again, this one is another complete no-brainer for me. If I had to list my 20 favorite artists of all time, probably be easier to list 100, but if I had to, Miles is up there, maybe even in the top 10. I'm a huge Miles head, have a lot of his music, and there's a lot of different periods where he did different things that were interesting. And, I know, for instance, that, I know the 60s quintet is the shit and all, with Wayne Shorter, Williams, Carter, Hancock, and, and Davis. And I love ESP, and that's, I know, a fan favorite among a lot of others. But really, if I'm going to see Miles, it has to be in this period with Coltrane, the two of them on the stage. Coltrane had played with Davis a bit earlier, and Davis had really been a booster of Coltrane, of course. I mean, he just found talent left, right, and center right through his career. That's one of his many talents that he had. But to really give Davis some credit here, again, he'd been boosting him in the mid-50s, when Coltrane really had still been a work in progress. And then he left Miles, and he spent about a year or so working while he was with Thelonious Monk's band. And it's when he came back from Monk and rejoined Davis's band that, for a lot of people, he really turned into quote-unquote Coltrane. He was now fully formed, in charge of what he was doing, and contributing to Davis's band for a couple of years in many amazing ways, until he just had to have a band of his own. I mean, he had been recording, but then his 60s career just goes off in a whole other direction. So sure, I'd love to see, that 65 group. Yeah, absolutely be amazing. But I'd give way more to been able to have seen Davis and Train standing and playing on stage right next to each other along with that group. That would be my choice. All right, so let's strap ourselves back in the time machine, crawl in, and we're just going on another short journey, just a few hours up the road, staying in the same city for my choice number 5. Judy Garland. Sunday, April 23rd, 1961, at Carnegie Hall, New York City. The famous concert that turned into the classic and best-selling live concert album, Judy at Carnegie Hall. Again, this is another no-brainer. Without question, this is the consummate entertainer of the 20th century. There's no way I would have wanted to miss seeing her live. As for when, again, this isn't a really tough pick. In and around that time, it was commonly referred to or known as the greatest night in showbiz history. Garland's Carnegie Hall shows found her at her apex as an artist and a live music performer. It happened just at the right moment between her earlier, sweeter voice, and then you had the voice more from the 50s, which again is sort of my favorite period, and through here. And, well, it was my favorite period, and I'll talk about this in a minute. I'm really finding I'm listening more to her later stuff, but it's right at this point where her voice had hardened, roughened, coarsened enough to really give it this mature, deep character, yet she could really, still belt him out. And the whole evening is just a soul-bearing tour de force through joy, despair, humor, sadness, strength, power, tragedy, and vulnerability, delivered often through this sprightly, spirited voice, providing these renditions of some of the greatest songs of the 20th century. Now, some of those songwriters were even there that evening. Harold Arlen was there. She mentions him during the performance. By all accounts from those in the audience, Judy was on fire that night, with one headline reading, "Judy in Orbit." And you can hear it. The energy from that night and the performance leaps out of the recording. And the recording itself, of course, was released as a double album, and it went on to become a #1 bestseller. And really she'd had a few career peaks, but in and around here, this was the last big peak. And also the stage patter, her talking in between the tracks, what she's saying to the audience, the story she's telling, hair and fashion disasters, or just sort of reassuring the audience that just hang in there for a few minutes while she goes and fetches the water. And I like that they left all that stuff in on the album, because a lot of that in between the tracks goes a long way in translating her personality from one medium to another and adding color to the overall performance. Still, I think that being there and seeing it live would have been absolutely something else. After Carnegie Hall, unfortunately, her life really started a long, slow slide that was irreversible, ending with her tragic overdose on June 22nd, 1969. And again, more as time goes on, I am starting to get interested in some of those later recordings where her voice really was kind of giving out in many ways. On the blog, I have a great video up, and I believe it's her last appearance on TV in the U.S., December 68 on Carson, doing the song After the Holidays. It is the most wrist-slashing Christmas song you'll ever hear, but it's perfect. And she also does Just For You. And when I'm watching these two, and she looks easily 10, 15 years older than what she is, and she's very frail. When I watch these, it's almost like she's singing these songs directly to and about her audience, sort of as a goodbye. It's really poignant and bittersweet. Anyway, the Carnegie Hall concert, that would be my choice of when to see her live. It's a master class for a particular vein of earlier interpretive singing, as well as answering the question, what is charisma? And so now we're going to get back in the time machine and just fly across the ocean a couple of years later. And now we're heading into the rock era as well, landing in the UK for number 6, The Beatles. And as for when and where, I am picking a particular point in early 1963, somewhere in the UK. I'll get back to this in a moment, what I mean. Again, this out of anyone here, this is one of two that are complete givens because they're one of my two favorite musical groups. The other one is coming up shortly. And they've been in my psyche my whole life. As I talked about in my introductory episode, music has been something that's been an obsession in my head going back to my earliest memories. Just the other week, I can't remember who it was, but I was reading it was an article in The Guardian. Somebody was writing, they were saying music hits you at around age 10. And usually that is true. That's generally the case, but not for me. So it's interesting. I was kind of born along with the Beatles, because I believe it's the same week I was born in mid-December that Love Me Do was peaking in the UK chart. So we both had long gestations, and we both sort of came into the world at the same time. And I've been a lifelong Beatle nut. That's never really changed. And there's a couple of Paul McCartney shows coming up down the line. So I'll save a lot of that stuff for those shows. And we'll go into that then. As for when, it was tempting to pick the Cavern in, say, later 61 or 62, or later 61, early mid 62 at the Cavern would also be good. But I'm picking early 63, and for this reason. As I've talked about in some of the other episodes, one of the differences between just sitting at home and listening to music and going out to a live show is that social aspect and the buzz created by the crowd, everyone being there, everyone being into it. So they had Love Me Do, the first hit in late 62 in the UK, and at the beginning of 63 was Please Please Me, the single, which went to number 1, and then the album, and thus began Beatlemania in the UK. And they went on a tour. And from my understanding and reading, sort of in that period before the end of the year and the early months of 63, as they were playing, they kind of went from having a hit to popular to big to Beatlemania. And it was a gradation over essentially weeks, probably, between the end of 62 and I'd say about April or so of that year. And it's somewhere in there where I'd like to have seen them when there was a buzz about the band. You knew this was a band, because there's always that something about a band that's on the rise that you like, that everyone's out to see, and there's just that extra buzz around them. If you're a gig goer, you're into that, and you're into all this, you know what I mean. So I'd like to have as maximum buzz I can, but I would like to have actually heard the music, because literally, from what I've read in different accounts, as they were playing in early 63, you could still hear the tunes, but at some point that just ended and vanished, and that was it forever. So I'd like to hit that moment, and I don't know when it would be, it's lost to history, where the maximum amount of buzz would intersect with actually being able to hear the music, as opposed to, for instance, they played their first gig in London, I think it was September or October of 62, and there's pictures online you can see, and you immediately know it's that gig, because they played somewhere in the suburbs of London. They weren't known at all in the South. Love Me Do hadn't come out. They were stars, big performing stars in the North. It's not like they were nobodies before they made it, but down south, they were unknowns. So the first gig Epstein booked them in, it wasn't well promoted. It wasn't a well-known club. So it's the only pictures you'll ever see with them on stage in their suits, but there's just a sparse audience in front of them, because it's the only gig they played by the time they had gotten in their suits where they weren't playing for a sizable crowd. So that might have been neat to have seen, but and I guess if they would have been, I don't know. I still kind of like the idea that I would have known a bit of what I was seeing, but could still hear the tunes. You get what I'm saying. All right, then. So back in the time machine, but we're staying in the UK this time. And again, we're going up just a couple of years for the next few entries, where we're going to be hovering around the mid to late 60s, sort of the 65, 67 era for these next two acts. And so it's on to my choice number 7, and Dusty Springfield. Again, somewhere in that 65 to 67 period, and specifically in the UK. Now, don't even get me started about Dusty. He's one of my all-time favorite singers, and she's one of those people that I liked her when I was younger, and the more and more I've gone on in life, the bigger and bigger fan I have become. One of the all-time greatest voices and personalities, with the breathy elocution, the powerhouse vocals, panda eyes, the piled bouffants, her whole image, but just the records are incredible. She's amazing. Her voice is amazing. And I know she would have been sheer dynamite to see live. And I know this because the videos exist from her UK TV series and live performances of that period. I have the one of all her BBC shows. She had a BBC series. She had a few of them in the late 60s, and they scoured the earth because all that stuff got wiped. And most of it turned up at various places around the world, and you watch her and she's amazing. But there's also some live stuff, her at the Enemy Poll Winners gigs at Wembley, and absolutely incredible. And specifically, the reason why I'm picking the UK and this time is Dusty had her own dedicated backing band, the Echoes, and a dedicated group of backing singers who went on to note of their own. Kiki Dee, especially, she was one of them. Leslie Duncan, who wrote the famous song Love Song, which has been recorded by many people, including Elton John and David Bowie, and recently Marianne Faithfull, a little while back, and Madeline Bell as well. The point of it is she had her own band, she had her own musicians, and she had her own way of doing things, which was highly unusual for a quote-unquote girl singer to have had in that time, because the whole thing is they had to come off as basically most of the female acts, the teenage female acts, they were heavily manufactured. And the idea was you're going to be told what to sing it, how to look, where you're going to appear. And Dusty didn't have any of that. Her records, actually, she produced her records in the 60s. If you see her records and you turn them around, you will not see her name on the production credits, but she produced them. And the thing was she was a lesbian, of course, as we all know now, and she was a tomboy. Dusty, of course, was her nickname from when she was young, when she would go out and play with all the boys and get dusty. But she was so obsessed, as they were in the 60s, to all the female singers to appear very feminine. And the idea that a woman would be producing her own records and telling the musicians what to do was just seen as, it would literally almost have sunk her career. It was so unladylike. And her, apparently, from what I've read in biographies, her thing was, I don't care what name you stick on the producer's label. My name is going on the artist label. These are my records, and they're going to sound the way I want them to sound, and I'm doing this till everyone gets it right. So she was tough, but hey, listen to the results. They were damn good. So the thing is that she had this regular group of musicians. They played together. They recorded together. Usually it was a thing that, sort of quote-unquote girl singers were given backup musicians, which is what Dusty did when she toured the States. That's why I would only want to see her in the UK. Because when she was with this group of people, as well as her hairdresser in the East End, where, her East End, townhouse was one of her favorite places to be. Dusty would go and see one of the few places Dusty could go and fall asleep and relax. But when she was with these musicians, she felt very relaxed, very protected, and that's when she could sing at her best. And she always was at her best with basically her musical family around her. And of course, later on, she went to the States. It really fell apart. It was very, very sad what happened. But later on in life, she had the comeback with the Pet Shop Boys, and then on her own. There's the fantastic Reputation album, but she was finally finding peace at the end, and then sadly she got cancer and died. But she did know peace at the end. She had a very tough life. If you've read Carol Pope's book, Anti-Diva, there's an amazing chapter in that book about the two of them when they were going out in the early 80s. One of the greatest voices and performers of the 20th century, and so choice number 7, Dusty Springfield, somewhere in the UK in the mid-60s. And so now we're staying in the same time zone, but we're crossing over the Atlantic for choice number 8, Otis Redding. Again, somewhere in the 65 to 67 period. Again, some of these are obvious picks, but they're obvious because these are some of the most amazing artists ever. And again, if you've seen any footage of Otis, it's incredible. Monterey Pop, he's got a great segment in that, but there's all sorts of performing videos. I've got a neat one. It's from a Ready, Steady, Go show done in the UK in 65 with Otis Redding. I've got that on VHS somewhere. Now I can't remember the name, but it was an episode of the UK's Ready, Steady, Go that he hosted. I believe Eric Burden's on there as well. It's been a while since I've seen it. But absolutely incredible performer who, of course, his career was tragically cut short by the plane crash in December 67. And it was just as Dock of the Bay was coming out. And from what I have read in his personal life, he was really exploring a lot of different kinds of music that were coming out in other genres. And I think Dock of the Bay was one of the first songs that he was going to start experimenting with things. So it's really sad because he had this amazing run of R&B classics in the 60s. And that's why I'm picking this time frame, because by 65, he had Otis Blue done. That's the year that came out. That's my favorite Otis Redding album. And he had the big hits, These Arms of Mine, Mr. Pitiful, That's How Strong My Love Is. So in this period, he had all his great hits. He was performing, no city or venue really sticks out for me. I think I would have preferred to have seen him. Oh, we'll say this. Of course, there's the famous Monterey pop performance, and I might do one sometimes about festivals that I missed. But I think I would have preferred to have seen him sort of headlining a bill in a club or a small hall, where I could have seen him and experienced the show in a more intimate setting. I think that he and his band in their prime would have been live music at its very best, because he had that incredible band behind him that he brought with him from his Stack sides. And what can I say? Just an absolutely incredible performer. The videos are there to watch, mesmerizing. You don't really read about anyone who saw him and had anything bad to say. And again, it's such a shame, because it seems like if you look at what his then peers went on to do. For example, Marvin Gaye made What's Going On. After he left the Impressions, Curtis Mayfield released Superfly, along with Roots and other albums. Stevie Wonder made that innovative series of albums, working with electronic music visionaries Robert Margoloff and Malcolm Cecil, and it literally created a new sonic language. Yeah, and then there's Funkadelic and Sly and the Family Stone with There's a Riot Going On. And you have to wonder what Otis might have gone on to do if he lived. It's that what if. But we'll always have his music, we'll have the live clips, but without a doubt, he died way too young. So with these last two shows, as I said, I was giving the 65 to 67 window. So let's hit the difference and say 66. And with that, it's safe to say that 66 is the biggest year where I'm really hovering. There's a bunch of shows, because that's sort of the mid-60s, and the next few are all specifically in 1966. So I guess if I can see Otis anywhere, how about I pick New York City? Because that way I don't have to get back in the time machine. I can probably just walk a few blocks to my choice number 9. The Velvet Underground and Nico. April 66, during their residency at the Dom as part of Andy Warhol's Exploding Plastic Inevitable in New York City. Now, as I was saying, the Beatles and the Velvet Underground, I was talking about the Beatles earlier, the Velvet Underground are my other most favorite band. Them and then David Bowie would be along with them as well. But my two favorite groups are the Beatles and the Velvets, which if you've read the blog and that, people will know that. And people who know me know that. So anyway, I'll move on. So again, it's, pretty much, it's a given that they would be on the list. And I don't want to go into too much history on the Velvets, because John Cale's coming up a couple of times. Actually, he's coming up fairly soon in the series, and there's a blog entry that you can read for that show from 1983. I keep a close watch. That was an amazing show. I can't wait to talk about that one. And Lou is not only coming up twice, but thrice. So I'll be talking a lot about the Velvets in the future. So now I'll just kind of focus more on when I would have liked to have seen them. And absolutely, part of me would also have liked to seen the later 60s Velvets when they were a more cohesive touring unit and doing those long workouts of those songs. And, there's the great, the Matrix tapes and all that. But no, I want to see the Velvet Underground and Nico. I would love to have seen them all together. And this also marries my Warhol obsession. He's my favorite artist, and that whole 60s factory scene, ever since I've been in my teens. I've been absolutely fascinated by that world. And with the exploding plastic inevitable, it was a happening that featured the Velvet Underground playing their music, the long, loud drones, and Nico was with them on stage, singing a few numbers, playing tambourine. Then they would have the dancers, people from the factory like Gerard Malanga and Mary Warnov, and they would be projecting. First there was gel screens, so really this is one of the first light shows, and they would project the gel caps, the moving gels over the band, as well as Warhol's art. So it was really the first light show. By all accounts, this was a really overwhelming experience, but I think it would have been something to see them there. They would have been in their element, plus also the fact that they would have been part of this larger happening. And I've read about those shows at the Dome. I've seen the pictures. I think that's when they really solidified all what they were about. It's also they'd been recording their album at that time. So it's the shows at the Dome in April of 66 with Nico. That's my choice number 9. Now, with this show, of course, I could never go to it, but this is actually, it's the only show on the list, I think, where I actually did get to attend something that was of a simulation. And it was in an absolutely brilliant art and ephemera exhibition, if we're being specific, at the Musée des Beaux-Arts in Montreal in November of 2008, Andy Warhol Live. And it was a whole show about Warhol's relationship personally and professionally as an artist with the music community. So it had, for instance, every album cover he'd ever designed. And that was before my birthday, so I got the book. Cublet bought the book for me of the show, and then there's another book of all his album covers. And it also had the behind-the-scenes stories, really funny letter from Mick Jagger. Actually, he designed Sticky Fingers, but the cover he was supposed to initially design was the second Stones hits album. It came out in the late 60s, but that didn't happen. It got delayed. And then it had an artwork of musicians and all that sort of thing. And then it also had him as a fan. So, for instance, he had an opera membership, and they had all his stubs from the opera. Anyway, the key thing here is they had this one room you could go into, and it was sort of a recreation of the Dom shows. It was this huge room, all dark. In the middle, they had this huge circular couch, this really comfy circular couch in the middle of the room. And you could go on the couch, just sit back and lay back, and they were projecting the gel slides that had been used at the original shows at the Dome in 66, or, recreations thereof, and had this enormous sound system in there, and it was sound tight, and they were blasting the Velvet Underground, various tracks, some live, some just tracks from the albums, but augmented with a live sound. So very, very cool. And you could sort of have a bit of an idea watching all the visuals, hearing the music mixed with crowd sounds. It gave you some sort of idea of being there. So Musée des Beaux-Arts, merci beaucoup. And so on to show number 10. Now we're going to get in the time machine, but we don't have to travel anywhere in time. We just have to get from one coast to the next. So we can arrive in the summer of 1966 at choice number 10. The Doors at the Whiskey A Go-Go in Los Angeles. They were the house band that summer, the summer of 66. They were a local sensation, but they hadn't broken big. Their album didn't come out till January of 67. So again, it's that thing of a buzz when a new band's coming along. They've got a new sound, a new approach, a new idea. You're hearing something for the first time. In episode 10, I talked about hearing the Talking Heads at Heatwave and their new sound and just how mind-blowing it was. And so at this point, they wouldn't have been known by the larger world, but in LA, they were the hot new band, and people were there and seeing them. And I think the shows would have been really incredible. It would have been new kind of music that had not been heard, a new approach, and of course the unique sound of the band, with Ray Manzarek's keyboards and Robbie Krieger's beautiful playing, of course, and Jim Morrison as the focal point and lead vocalist. And it's interesting with the Doors too, because when I was younger, I remember my siblings liking them, and I remember their friends bringing Doors albums over. I remember the cover to Strange Days really freaking me out, but it was neat, but it freaked me out. But there weren't any Doors albums in our home, and it's one of those bands I just really took to on my own. And one of the first singles I ever owned was on my 5th birthday in 1968. I watched them perform Touch Me, and it's their new single, and it's B-side Wild Child. And I just loved it, and I obviously asked for it, and I got that single. So, yeah, I was listening to Touch Me and Wild Child when I was 5, so I was a bit of a different kid. And, with Wild Child, the song that's on the B-side, and it's on the Soft Parade. When I was younger, I would hear that song, and I would think of it literally. Of course, it's kind of a young person rebelling, but I would see it literally as some, deranged fellow 5-year-old, losing their mind, anyway. It's funny how you interpret things that literally or see it in your own way when you're a kid. One other weird thing I'll throw in about the Doors is I've only ever known 3 people who saw them, and 2 of them who were big Doors fans, and actually their tastes tended to be fairly close to mine. They were both really disappointed. I had 2 people say that. They went, and I really was expecting more, but they were one of the big disappointments. That's interesting. But I would like to go and make up my own mind myself. And I think especially with a band like the Doors, and, Jim Morrison was so mercurial, I could see there being good nights, and really, well, again, you've done the reading as all of us have, as they had some really disastrous nights, but, I think when they were on, they would have been great. Okay, so we're going to climb back in the time machine, and this time, again, we're in 66. That's kind of the year for me, I guess. And we're going up just a little bit later in the year. We're climbing into our time-traveling UFO and going from West Coast U.S. psychedelia across the pond over to the UK in a UFO to the UFO Club in London for my choice number 11, Syd Barrett's Pink Floyd. And I would love most to have seen them in late 66, early 67, that period, at the UFO Club in London. It's the same sort of thing. The Doors were in that residency at the Whiskey A Go-Go, the UFO Club in that for the early part of Floyd, which is my favorite part. That was a club they were very associated with and played a lot. Now, for me, definitely that early period of Floyd, The Piper at the Gates of Dawn, that was on my short list on the blog for my favorite albums of all time. Probably my Pink Floyd song is Apples and Oranges. I'm really a huge Barrett fan, and, the Madcap Laughs and Barrett, and, but I do like some of the Floyd stuff that followed. I was not huge on a lot of the 70s stuff, but more these days, I like more of it, especially the one 70s Floyd album that I genuinely have grown to love through the years is Wish You Were Here. Even if the second part of Shine On You Crazy Diamond I don't like as much as the first, but that's the one I play the most. And come to think of it, I've actually had Adam Hart Mother on a few times recently. Anyway, it's the really, really early stuff with Floyd. Again, it's that thing that they weren't known really outside of London, but in this insular world, they were the new stars. They had the new sound. They were defining the new scene. There was that buzz, and Syd Barrett was still, functioning well and playing. And so it's that period where the vision was coming together. There was a buzz around them, but they hadn't yet broken out of that bubble into the larger realm. And so it's these shows at the UFO that I would most like to have seen, or at least one of these shows. And of course, by mid-67, with all the acid and, what he'd been going through, that's when Barrett really started to decline, and, the shows were going badly, wasn't playing, that sort of thing. So again, this is the period, late 66, early 67, Pink Floyd, my choice number 11. Now, as I move on to my next gig, which is several years in the future, I'm actually going to be giving a ride in the time machine to one of the guys who's at this gig, and it's someone who in 66 probably would have seen some of these shows at the UFO, and his career, his new career was exploding onto the London scene, making a name for himself. So he needs to come with me to, we're jumping ahead to March 19th, 1972. So this guy from the gig is coming with me, and I'm dropping him off at the gig. And as we travel there, his mod clobber will morph into glitter and corkscrew hair. And when we arrive, I'll let Mark Bolan go and do his thing, and I'll announce my choice for number 12. T-Rex, March 19th, 1972, at the Wembley Empire Pool, London, UK. There were 2 shows, afternoon and evening. I'll take each one. Probably the afternoon, because it's kind of neat to go to the first one, but you know what? Whatever. I'll take either show. Actually, now I can't remember, because I've got we'll be talking about Born to Boogie in a moment. Can't remember if it's the afternoon or evening that they use in the feature. Anyway, I'll check it out. Now, here's the really weird thing with Mark Bolan and T-Rex. As I've discussed in the Roxy Music episode, I think it was episode 2, of my first show, and I've talked about when I saw Bowie in Ottawa in the early 70s. While I've always had a wide variety of music, there's usually some sort of mothership, and it's usually within the realm of, especially then, rock music, and glam rock was it for me in the early 70s. Bowie, Roxy, the New York Dolls, Suzi Quatro, Mott the Hoople, Lou Reed. This was the soundtrack to my early teens. Yet, for whatever reason, T-Rex, I didn't dislike T-Rex, but they just really weren't on my radar. Of course, Get It On had been a big hit. And here in southwestern Ontario, actually Telegram Sam and Metal Guru were both hits as well. So I knew those 3 songs, and I liked them, but for whatever reason, they didn't really blow me away. I didn't really start getting into, or maybe making the association of the whole glam thing until early 1973. And so by that point, T-Rex were in decline. See, here's also the other thing with Bolan. I mean, he had this 10-year recording career, and I do like some of his early stuff. There was John's Children, and I do like some of the Tyrannosaurus Rex stuff. But really, for me, it's Ride a White Swan through to, say, Truck on Tyke. So end of 1970, that T-Rex album through to early 73. It's this incredible period where everything, now in retrospect, I know all the music. Everything works. It's just amazing. It's Electric Warrior, The Slider, an amazing time. But for me, after 73, there's only a handful of songs I like after that. So by the time I was really kind of getting focused more on glam music and all that, his time was kind of passing. That could have been it. And I remember, and I've talked about how I went to England in 77, and it was a weird trip music-wise because the day before we left, Elvis died. And so when we got there, it was all about Elvis's death, and Elvis was everywhere, and I heard Way Down 5 million times. But we were there for a few weeks, and we were staying with relatives in different parts of the country, in hotels and others, but generally with a lot of relatives. And so we'd be home, for tea time or whatever. And so we'd get home later afternoon, and he had this show that was on British television at the time called Mark. And I saw a couple of episodes while I was there, and I liked it. Unfortunately, he had some great guests on. The Jam were on, Generation X. The weeks I saw the acts weren't all that interesting, but still, I kind of enjoyed the show. And then he died the day before I left England, so this was very strange. So I kind of knew of him, and I'd seen the show, and I kind of liked the show when I saw it. But then, I was really into punk and all that sort of thing. And it was a piece in the NME that Paul Morley wrote in 1980 on Mark Bolan. And that's what really got me interested in wanting to go back and hear those albums. And shortly thereafter, I bought Electric Warrior, and then I got a tape deck and taped The Slider, and then singles from a compilation. So I really got into him later on. It was 10 years after. But again, this is all about going back in time. So that would be it, my time machine. I'd go back to 1972. And of course, he was just massive in the UK around this time. Now, according to Wikipedia, during this period, sales of T-Rex recordings accounted for about 6% of total British domestic record sales. Wow, that's incredible. This gig occurred shortly before The Slider was released and after a period of being away from Britain for a while. So these shows were instant sellouts and they were filmed by Ringo Starr, eventually released as part of the Born to Boogie film many years later. So let's say you have a want or need to view a sea of screaming, glittered up, pink-cheeked British youths going absolutely stark raving mad during a performance. I cannot recommend that you head to Born to Boogie and watch it as quickly as possible. Starr actually intentionally accentuated the going bonkers audience, concluding that the audience is always part of the concert and he would know as a musician. And really, that's what part of this series is about. Is live concerts. You're going to see the musician, but it's about the musician and the audience engaging and the synergy that comes from that. Anyway, it's an amazing movie, and there's some really hilarious bits. There's one with him and Ringo Starr where they're trying to just get some banter, scripted banter right on screen, and they're so stoned they just eventually give up. Anyway, it's fun to watch, and the performances are great. Okay, so we're crawling back into the time machine, and geographically, we don't have to travel anywhere. There's actually 4 London, UK shows in a row. So we're staying in the city, but just traveling 3 years into the future for choice number 13. Led Zeppelin at one of their Earl's Court shows in London, England, in the UK in May of 1975. Led Zeppelin get my vote as the greatest hard rock band of all time, and without question, as a live band, they were a true force of nature in their heyday when on stage. And I'm still so devastated that they didn't tour in 2007 following that reunion at the O2, and that's a great gig. Apparently Robert Plant wasn't into it, but such a shame. I had the money saved and everything. And Robert's coming up down the road, and he did a great show. Actually, you can read about it on the mylifeinconcert.com blog. It's from 2011. Great show, but still, I would love to have seen Zeppelin, but of course, in the 70s, in their heyday, is absolutely the time frame I would have picked. Now, I'm including them on the list. There's always this tiny speck that they may get back together with Jason Bonham and do some shows or a tour, and you never know. But the chances of that happening and of me actually getting to see them is very slim. So I'm keeping them on this list. Now, while I could have easily enjoyed seeing them on any of the early tours, it's the shows that they did in May of 1975 at Earl's Court in London. Those are the shows I'm picking, and for a few reasons. I really think the band was at their peak at that point, certainly live, but also they had just released Physical Graffiti a few months earlier. And that's one of those albums that when I was younger, I used to think it was kind of patchy. I have no idea what I was thinking. I can't explain that. Over time, it's actually become my absolute favorite Led Zeppelin album. And in the last few years, I've almost become obsessed listening to it. I also used that classic cover from Physical Graffiti for my 8th anniversary posting. With the blog for each anniversary, I mark it by doing a mock-up of an album cover that I like. So please check out what I did for my 8th anniversary, where I used the Physical Graffiti cover. I worked from a photo that my nephew had taken in New York City a couple of years ago. Thanks for the photo. And anyway, check it out because I spent a lot of time on it. Anyway, so that period is, I think they really hit their peak at that point. And of course, they put out that amazing live DVD earlier in the century, the self-titled one that's way, way better than The Song Remains the Same. And the Earl's Court stuff is my favorite. Actually, there's a whole sequence of 6 tracks that I watch regularly on this disc. There's the last one at Madison Square Garden for The Song Remains the Same session footage, The Ocean. Why that wasn't in the movie, I don't know. But then it moves over to Earl's Court, and they start with that trio of acoustic numbers, and Led Zeppelin's acoustic stuff is some of my favorite stuff as well. And they used to do that acoustic set of Going to California, That's the Way, and Bron-Y-Aur Stomp. And there's one point in Bron-Y-Aur Stomp where it Page is playing so quietly and so delicately, and generally most of the audience is really quiet and listening. It's incredible how he's holding them there, the power to do that. But it's the next two tracks of the footage, In My Time of Dying, which over the years has become my favorite Zeppelin song, and Trampled Underfoot, another big favorite, and the live version here is even better. Stairway to Heaven they have there as well, but I always skip that one. If I never hear it again, I'm good. But those two tracks, if I'm trying to make the case that I think they're the greatest hard rock band of all time and one of the best live bands of all time, I would actually point someone to those two numbers from the Earl's Court show, In My Time of Dying and Trampled Underfoot. They are absolutely on fire in those tracks, and that's about 20 minutes of music. So definitely I would love to have been there. That's the show I'd most like to have seen. But hey guys, if you find it in your heart to go out, I'd still love to see them play live. So now we're in London, England. It's May of 1975. All we have to do is jump in the time machine and shoot up 2 months to July 18th, 1975 for choice number 14. Bob Marley and the Wailers. July 18th, 1975 at the Lyceum Theatre, London, the show that turned into the Bob Marley live album. Now, in episode 9A, called Waiting in Vain, 22 performances I missed, I discuss seeing Bob Marley. I was supposed to see him on December 4th, 1980, here in London, Ontario, at the London Gardens. And of course, the gig and the entire tour got canceled because of his cancer, and he passed away the next year. And that's in 9A. You can go listen to that episode, and I talk all about Marley in that one and what it meant for me to discover Marley in the 70s and reggae and the impact of all that. So I discussed that there. I won't rehash it. I will just say that out of those 22 gigs on that list, if there's one gig I could make happen to have seen, that is the show. So in terms of when I would most like to have seen him, though, I'm picking this July 18th, 1975 gig. Again, I keep going back to that buzz factor. And this was a time Marley was breaking through. His music was breaking through. He put out Natty Dread, which had taken him to a whole new level. And as I discussed in episode 9, that's where I first heard him. And sort of at this performance, you can hear it in the live album. Another thing I'll talk about is generally, I'm not a huge fan of live albums. They're fun to listen to. And I'll buy for artists that I like. But in terms of when I think of artists, their core, most essential releases, not so much in jazz, but, rock, R&B and all that, live albums tend not to be the essential releases. But of course, there's plenty of exceptions. And I think Bob Marley live is one of them. Just the electricity of the performance. And you can absolutely feel it that the audience was so vibed to be there. You can hear it. And the band, of course, they're breaking through. There's that excitement, that palpable buzz, the excitement. Everyone is completely at 10 in terms of their focus and excitement. And those are always the best gigs and situations. I think when you're listening to a live album, essentially you're only getting part of the performance because part of it is being there in the moment. But I think that's one album where just the ebullience of the artist and the audience and the cohesion and synergy and alchemy of all those things coming together, it just spills out of the recording. I'm sure it would have been just an amazing show to have been at. So, number 14 on my list. Now for number 15, we're leaving 1975 and the UK and skipping 12 months into the future and landing in Switzerland, the only show on the list in Switzerland. For my choice number 15, Nina Simone at the Montro Jazz Festival, July 3rd, 1976. Now, Nina Simone is one of those artists where I remember hearing her name when I was younger. I didn't really know her music, and I didn't really know much about her. And particularly when I got into the 80s, I would see her name coming up more and more. I would hear it, and I was going back and really discovering a lot of older jazz and R&B, and her music didn't seem to be around as much. And it wasn't until the late 80s when I bought a compilation of her secondhand, The Best of Nina Simone. It's the Phillips one from that, I think, 63 to 65 period. When I got the album, it took me a while to really process it because I was listening to it and I was like, this music doesn't have a genre. Like I associated her, I think, more with jazz I heard, but there was R&B, there were classical elements, there was Broadway elements, there was pop elements. There really was no genre here, which was interesting. Kind of made it hard for me to wrap my head around. And I bought a couple more of her live albums, but it really wasn't until later on, because I still didn't really hear a lot of her music or know about her, and it was kind of more about 10 years ago, or less than that. It was earlier last decade, and it's when the documentary, What Happened, Miss Simone, was being made and put together. And I can't remember which, whether it was Mojo or Vanity Fair, but one of them did this really big, in-depth piece on her and her career. And it's when I read that this all made sense. The reason I hadn't heard her music is essentially she'd been blacklisted over here. And of course, that genrelessness that I talked about, that made her harder to market, not to mention, she had her own way of doing things and she'd been treated horribly and there were a lot of scars and there were mental health issues. So it all made sense. And when that documentary came out in 2015, I watched it. I think I've watched it about 8 or 9 times. I had also started digging much more deeply into her catalog as well. But the other thing that happened was as YouTube came along, I started watching her videos. All these performance videos from throughout her career started showing up. And I started watching them, and that's when I really got interested. And there's one clip in particular I played many, many times, and it was her performing a version of Janis Ian's Stars that actually segued into, the Schlockmeister classic du jour, Feelings. And somehow she managed to literally drag feelings out of this song. And I would watch this long clip and it was fascinating to me, but I didn't know the significance. I knew it was at Montro, but there was no context for anything. That was the weird thing too with the genrelessness, is when I bought that compilation in the 80s, there was no dates, there was no notes, there was nothing. So it was hard for me to even figure out, within the period of a couple of years of when the music even came from, because it was hard to date, because the music really doesn't date. And when I heard the song Mississippi Goddamn, I thought, wow, this is incredibly powerful. And just based on the lyrics and how it was being delivered, I figured, okay, this would have come out, say, even though I knew it was about the Alabama bombings, I figured, okay, this would have been, say, 68, 69, 70, 71, in around there. And then I found out years later, this was 1963. I'm like, holy shit, whoa, that's intense. And that word intense informs why I'm picking this concert. When you watch the documentary, What Happened, Miss Simone, it's on Netflix. I highly encourage you to do so. One of the things, well, it starts off with a clip from the Montro Jazz Festival that I'm talking about, this date. And they keep going back to it throughout the documentary. So the concert itself was now available on Blu-ray and DVDs, Blu-ray and CD, so I ordered both. And I sat down and got the DVD of the whole concert. It's 90 minutes long. I've watched it about 8 or 9 times. It's something you really have to see, because at this point she had left the States. She'd been living in Africa for a few years, but she'd lost all her money. Her mental health issues were really starting to be a major problem, and she had to go back to work, so she moved to Switzerland. And this was her first concert, I think, outside of Africa in many years. It's 90 minutes long. Essentially, there's 5 songs. At the end, she does some dancing while a drummer sort of drums to African Mailman. But essentially, it's just 5 songs. And I've got the CD, and the CD is about 45 minutes of music because they just have the music. Half of the performance is her talking. And, I realize she's under, mental duress, but you can't look away from this. She's going into all this stuff. And one of the things her daughter says in the documentary is that, eventually they got her mother on meds. She was properly diagnosed, looked after. She ended up living a life where she could have a career, but she couldn't get as far out there into the intensity once she was on the meds. It allowed her to have a good life, but it impeded the realms that Simone could reach in her performance. So in this, and it's shot mostly in close-up, so it's like you're sitting right next to her. She's having, these dark moments you can't look away from, and then she launches into the tunes. And, okay, with Led Zeppelin, if I wanted to give an example of what I would see as an amazing hard rock band, and I'd show those two numbers, if I wanted to show someone my idea of what an intense performance is, this is it. She launches into these tunes and she just completely embodies them and goes into a whole other place. And again, that so much of it is shot in close-up and with her fingers, and with her fingers on the keys, it's quite intense. But to have been in that audience and hearing the music, except of course if you needed to go to the bathroom, that you'll have to watch the video to find out what I'm talking about. Absolutely, it would have been incredible to have been in that room with that energy. Actually, not too long ago, a couple of months before the lockdown, a friend of mine came over, and he's a big music fan and likes Nina Simone, and the Blu-ray was sitting out, and he saw it, and we were talking about it. So I had music on. I just put the music off and kind of put the video on, sort of as music in the background when we talked, which was a stupid idea, because within about 5 minutes or so, we stopped talking and we just sat and watched the whole thing. Again, it's kind of hard to just have it on in the background. And he was like, wow. So definitely, if you haven't seen it, check it out. It moves between some really uncomfortable bits to some of the most incredible performances I've seen. So that's my choice of when I would like to have seen the great Nina Simone. And now back in the time machine, but we're not arriving at a specific destination or time this time. Instead, we're just sort of floating around the 1972 to 1978 period. So somewhere in that time frame, I'd like to see my choice number 16, Fela Kuti and Africa 70. So, as with Nina Simone, Fela Kuti is a name I heard early on, but really didn't get more into until later. I didn't hear the name until the Talking Heads and Remain in Light. And in the last episode, episode 10, Once in a Lifetime, at the Heatwave Festival, I talked about how the Talking Heads set may have been the best set of music I'd ever seen, and they debuted the new sound and band that made Remain in Light, which would be released a few months later. And absolutely, Fela Kuti and Africa 70 were one of the key musical influences on that album and its sound. So I heard the name bandied around then, but didn't really know a whole lot and didn't get to hear him until November of 1988. This I really remember. Another great gig I can't wait to talk about down the line. The first time I saw Sonic Youth at the Diamond in Toronto a few weeks after Daydream Nation was released. A bunch of us went down in a van and somebody had a tape of Fela Kuti, and I had some particularly intense wall banger shrubbery with me that day for the trip down. And so I just remember being in the back of the van and the music playing and getting so into it. But for whatever reason, I didn't really explore his tunes, probably because at that point I was a broke student and couldn't afford to be buying everything sort of thing. But it was more this century I started to investigate and hear his music. I bought the Black President double disc compilation and went from there and started going back and buying those twofers of his albums that were released and was just blown away. I mean, most of these albums are just sidelong jams, but that sounds so indulgent, but it's not, because there's so much going on in the music, all the different musicians. It takes that long to work the whole track out. So this, I think, is some of the most incredible music I've ever heard. And again, with YouTube, I've gone back and watched a lot of older videos, and there's no doubt in my mind I would absolutely, again, they're on the list. It's one of the bands I would have most liked to have seen. And while his records are amazing, I just have this feeling that to have seen the band live and in person would have been at a whole other level. Okay, so back into the time machine we go, but we're still hovering around this same period. Actually, if this was 76 that I saw Fela Kuti, it would be 4 shows from 76. As it turns out, there's 3. There was the Nina Simone show from earlier. Now we're zooming back to a particular point in 76. We're going to see 2 shows that were pretty much at about the same time, but in different places and in very different circumstances. So the time machine goes back to 1976 for choice number 17. The band and all of their many friends at The Last Waltz, the concert that was known as The Last Waltz, and of course became the film of the same name. November 25th, 1976 at the Winterland Ballroom, San Francisco. Without a doubt, the band for me are the greatest rock ensemble unit that ever existed. The model for all that, and never really bettered. And I know for, a fact they would have been incredible to see live, all of those musicians on the stage. But absolutely, this is a no-brainer. As with the Judy Garland show, this is the show I'd like to have seen. I mean, I specifically wanted to avoid festivals for this list. That can be a whole other list. But the band play all their classic material, and of course all the people who drop by, including fellow Canucks Neil Young and Joni Mitchell, along with their old boss Bob Dylan, plus Eric Clapton, Van Morrison, etc., etc., etc. The film, I have watched and enjoyed it countless times, but man, do I ever wish I could have been there. Although the band just performing as a unit, I think they would have been good at any time. And they're except for Levon, they're all from this area. So it's my understanding that in other places there are more of, especially in the States, they were more of an FM thing. Whereas here, because I'm in London, Ontario, Garth Hudson grew up in my hometown of London, Ontario. Rick Danko's from the Simcoe area, not too far away. Same with Richard Manuel was from Stratford, and of course Robbie was from Toronto, the furthest away. But they're all local heroes. And growing up, the band here, they're all local heroes. We're very much an AM radio hit band. I mean, growing up, we didn't have any FM stations that I could get here growing up in London. Later on, if you had cable, which we didn't have, you could get some from the States, but we didn't have any we could tap into. So all I had was AM radio, but the band had hit after hit after hit all through, late 60s, all through the 70s till they ended. But absolutely, this is the gig I would choose to see. And of course, luckily, we have the great Martin Scorsese film to watch in its place. And unfortunately, things ended really badly for a lot of members of the band. I know there's a lot of bitterness. It's really unfortunate. Actually, there's a brand new documentary that's out that I really want to see, but regardless, The Last Waltz will be there, and those timeless recordings will live on. I just wish I had seen them in the flesh anyway. So we're staying in 1976, but we're crossing the ocean back to the UK for a very different show that I don't have a specific date in mind, but it would have been a show from about this period. And for number 18, I am picking the Sex Pistols. Now, again, that's another no-brainer for me. Punk, this band, and never mind the bollocks, all of this was very life-changing for me. And I have discussed the incalculable impact that punk and the whole questioning and overturning of stale ideas that it had on me in episodes 3, 7, 8, 9, and 10, and more coming up. So I think I'll skip over rehashing all that for now. They did reform a number of times and did a few tours, and all of, the key members, of course, Glenn Matlock was in the original lineup and was in the reformed lineup. They're all still around, but again, my guess would be they're done reforming, and I've missed them. And it was a shame, too, because when I was in England in 1977, they were on tour in the UK at the time. They were banned from most places, so they were playing gigs under assumed names like The Spots, which in England is Acne, and also served as an acronym for Sex Pistols on Tour Secretly, etc., etc. I didn't get to see the Sex Pistols. I did get to see Susan Mon. Anyway, I'll discuss that at another time. So, assuming they won't be getting back together and I won't be seeing them, I'm setting the concert time machine to somewhere in the fall of 1976. Glenn Matlock was still the bass player. It seems that the band had coalesced. Whenever I see some of that early footage from that time, I'm hit by how tight they are. And around the time that they also recorded the Spunk demo, that version of the band, and before Anarchy in the UK had come out. Also around the time of that London Weekend Television special was the first real TV special done anywhere on punk by Janet Street Porter, which I had read about for years and seen snippets of, but it's only through the advantage of the internet and YouTube that I was finally able to get to see it, and was impressed that the show really gets it remarkably right for the first and one of the last times in mainstream media. Anyway, shortly after that, December 1st, they appeared on the Today Show in the UK, hosted by Bill Grundy, and of course, they had the big famous verbal kerfuffle, and they swore on television, and that was it. Overnight, they went from being a private affair by a small group of people to being front page news and the whole tabloidization of what had been going on. So again, it's that thing about a buzz of a band. Maybe the music people in the know about this group. So there's the excitement. The band's excited. They know that they're rising. They're being recognized. So I'd like to have seen them in the fall of 76, where they were really starting to happen. But, the external bullshit hadn't come in yet. Now for 19, this is another tricky one because when I first wrote this blog entry back in 2012, anyway, I haven't called it off. Number 19. Kate Bush. And initially when I wrote this, I had picked the Tour of Life, her only tour that she had done in April to May of 1979 in Europe and the UK. And this is what I wrote at the time. Okay. Along with Zepp and the Pistols, Kate is my third choice where the case may not be closed. After all, Kate is alive and very well and healthy, thank you very much. It's just that little thing about how, after a single jaunt through the UK and Europe, 1979's Tour of Life, the theatrical Ms. Bush flatly refused to tour or even play a full one-off live show. There were optimistic mumblings last year about her rethinking her no-touring policy once her son Bertie was ensconced in post-secondary education, but she shot these rumors down faster than James and his cold gun. And that really was the way things looked and appeared to be at that time. So in 2014, she surprised the dickens out of all of us with the Before the Dawn tour, a residency of, was it about 20 or 25 shows at the Hammersmith Apollo. It's a smaller venue, and she opted to play many nights at a more intimate venue rather than doing a tour, or rather playing one large place. And by all accounts, it was a very theatrical show. And it was in three parts. First, a number of just songs from some of her later albums. And then she did basically stage productions of The Ninth Wave, side 2 of The Hounds of Love, and A Sky of Honey, the thematic second disc from Ariel. And an absolutely brilliant approach to the show. There was a lottery to get tickets, even though it was a smaller venue and with many nights, still tons of people could not get in, could not get tickets. And there was hope she was going to take it elsewhere, do it again, but she hasn't since. And we're still waiting for the DVD. It was filmed. She did release in 2016 a live version, a triple live CD, which I really enjoyed, especially the new interpretations of The Ninth Wave and A Sky of Honey. I'm still waiting for that DVD to appear. It's got to come someday. But I remember a number of years back, Peter Gabriel saying that he and Kate Bush, he saw them as being part of this new musical movement, the snail movement, where things take years to happen. So, but when they do with Kate, it's always worth it. So while most of these shows were supposed to be up to and including 1980, and on the original list, I did pick the Tour of Life. I'm changing the tune from my original blog entry, and I would prefer to have seen Kate in 2014 at the Before the Dawn shows. And so I'll go back to the original choice there in 1979. April, May of 79, the Tour of Life, which was the original 19. And now we arrive at the final choice, which really is in the UK. It's either later that year or early the next year for my final choice on the list, number 20. Joy Division, somewhere in the UK. Well, that's the only places they were playing. Again, somewhere in late 79, early 1980, after Unknown Pleasures had come out, when they were recording, or around the time they were recording Closer. Now, hearing Joy Division for the first time, that's a memory that will always stick with me, and it was in the spring of 1980. And the Fanshawe radio station, which was the first FM station we got, and it was actually really bad in the late 70s, because by this point, punk and new wave and all this stuff was happening. And they were playing stuff, it's like middle of the road rock stuff. But there was this one guy who had this show on once a week, Thursday night, from about 10:30 to 11, where he kind of like played punk, new wave music. And in one of the episodes, he played a whole bunch of new import singles. And I used to tape his show every week. And one of the singles he played was by Joy Division, who I'd kept reading about in the British press. And I know that Unknown Pleasures had been one of the most acclaimed albums of the year before. And this was their single, Transmission. The minute that, Morse code bass starts and that ominous wash of sound, and then the drums come in and it's ominous yet exhilarating, I was an instant convert. As I said too, luckily I taped it and I just about wore out that part of the tape replaying that song. So now I was really, really happy that I'd heard them. I wanted to hear more. And because, I'd seen the Jam the year before in Toronto and I was getting a bit older. And of course I had seen Heatwave was coming up actually. I was thinking, wow, if they play here, they play Toronto, wow, I'd really like to see this band. Now, back then, again, this is before everything, way before the internet, anything. So especially news traveled very slowly. And you've got to understand, this was a small cult band in England. And I was just one of those people who I was always investigating new things. And for Joy Division, they were so avant-garde to most people, even people in the punk and new wave scene. The music was so strange and so out there to a lot of people. That may sound unusual now, but that's just how it was. But I had really become interested in this band and wanted to know more. And we would get copies of NME. They would come in, but it would take a few weeks before they got here. And I remember it was my brother-in-law had picked up the latest copy of the NME, and this would be in July, I think. But of course, it was an issue from a few weeks before in the later spring. And so there was this article about Joy Division. I'm reading it and I couldn't figure out, like, it was confusing to me because they were talking about they had this new album coming out, but the band was over. And as I read it, I realized, wait a minute, their lead singer has died. And it took me a while to sort of put the pieces together because, of course, in Britain, this story would have followed all this other news, but I didn't know this. And finally, I realized that, oh, shit, I've just discovered this band and the singer's dead. And anyway, I thought, oh, fuck. And then Closer came out in August. And I remember I bought one of the first copies for sale here down at Records on Wheels on Dundas Street in London in August. And I got that album home, and that was it. I actually just listened to it today. Come to think of it, I just had it on today. So it's one of those albums. I played it obsessively. It's always been in my life. I'm going to hear it forever. And I just wish I could have seen Joy Division. Luckily, there's a few pieces of footage of them, but a lot of what I've read is it's not the same as being there watching them. And they were very, very intense to watch, and the atmosphere in watching them was incredible. Of course, there's the movie 24-Hour Party People, if you haven't seen it, about Tony Wilson, and also the second part about Happy Mondays. But the first part of the movie is about Joy Division. And it's just an amazing movie. If you're into music and that world, it's really funny. It's really well written. It's Alan Partridge playing Tony Wilson, constantly breaking the fourth wall and talking to the audience. And with Happy Mondays, there's really only one Happy Mondays album I like, but admittedly, the story's really funny. And then, of course, there's the movie Control about Ian Curtis, and there's a great Joy Division documentary. So there's lots out there to see about the band, but I really wish that I could have seen Joy Division in the day. And again, pretty much by the time I was learning about them, they were almost gone. So I wish Ian Curtis had gone on and still been with us. Luckily, the band carried on, became New Order, and I love New Order as well, who I've never seen. I've never seen New Order either, and I'd love to see them, but hopefully I will. Their last album I just loved. But that's it. There you have it. My choice for the 20 acts I wish I had seen. So who would you like to have seen? Let's go back to the beginning. Who would you most like to have seen? Why? Where? When? Please remember to visit the mylifeinconcert.com website and to like and subscribe on Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube. Thank you for listening, and please come back for episode 12, the much-delayed jam show at the Rex Danforth Theatre in Toronto, April 79, which is concert number 4 in the series, picking up after Elvis Costello in late 1978. Come back for Paul, Bruce, and Rick, and stay tuned for Winkle Pickers, opening act Confusion, and The Magic Returns. This is your host, Various Artists, for mylifeinconcert.com. Again, thanks for listening, and we'll meet up at the next show. Bye for now.